there's your legal warning. You are now on camera and audio. And thank you so much.
You didn't tell me this.
As a second, or your first or second year law student, I got to make sure I
have 2 more classes left for my MPA, and then I'm done.
Congrats.
Yeah, so I'm as a part-time student, I'm in my 3rd year. So yeah, almost done.
And is that an actual law degree then you come out of?
No, it's a Master of Public Administration at a law school. So, I had a chance to take law classes and really get like a lot of emphasis in law for understanding my public administration degree. But no, I don't get a JD.
My friend Jamie just got that degree at Tulane.
Yeah. It's great. I started as a MPP, so Master of Public Policy. And then what I ended up figuring out was I took all the MPP courses that I wanted, and then I switched over to MPA. And it's a little less classes, it's cheaper, and it's actually better for me because I want to be able to run public agencies eventually, or nonprofits, so cool. Or both. So yeah, so it was just a perfect degree for me.
That's great. Well, let me do this. I thank you for coming on the show, dude. I think the cool thing about this is that we kind of got to know each other a little better on Facebook, or actually get to know each other on Facebook through our friend. And was it Tim Kennedy that introduced us, or was it Britt or Brett or any of our friends with one?
It was probably Tim.
Yeah, I think so
Britt.
too. Yeah, I think so too. And Brett and I went to high school together, and so I got to meet you, Britt, Sierra, a couple of just fantastic people, and all of us had a little bit. We lean one way or the other a little more than the other. So I thought that was really cool. So let me start with your resume, which is actually better than mine. So congrats. So
stop it.
You currently work with formerly homeless adults in permanent supportive housing in Sacramento County. You have a master's of public administration. You're a graduate student at the University of Pacific, McGeorge School of Law, and your graduation is May of 2022. You received a BA in sociology and philosophy from Humboldt State. I've been there many times, but I wasn't studying.
Oh, yeah.
Sacramento Executive Council Person for American Society for Public Administrators. And you're political organizer and advocate. You are the chair of Sacramento's Progressive Democrats of America, the chair of Sacramento Social Democrats of the United States of America, vice chair of political affairs for Young Democrats of America, and the Hispanic Latinx Caucus, and California delegate for Young Democrats of America. So, another thing that I thought was really relevant for you and why I wanted to invite you on the show is I think I explained to you briefly that I started this podcast originally to start talking about just complex topics. And I got into like men's masculinity and some depressionary things and stuff that I thought were cool. And then I was like, well, I need to talk about these really topical, controversial things that are happening in our culture, and not for any other reason other than I'm interested in them. And as a stay-at-home dad for the last 4 years, I've had more time to read than I've ever had in my life. And so I probably read about 2 books a week. And because of that, I thought maybe I should just shift the podcast to these really rich topics.
Yeah.
And so I talked to you briefly. I had a really neat conversation with a DEI consultant and author, Black author, and his name is Dax Devlin Ross. And I interviewed him about critical race theory. And it was a 2-hour, a little bit over that actually, 2.5 hours. And it was fascinating for me to read his book, which was called Letters to My White Male Friends. And I think I shared that with you and Brett and a couple other folks. Fantastic book. And this is kind of a follow-on to that. And then I'm talking tomorrow with a former professor from Notre Dame who I was fortunate enough to know. He was a philosophy professor. His name is Tom Morris, if you've ever heard of him.
No.
But we are talking about ideologies and kind of where they came from and the history. And because you have a philosophy background, you may be interested in that chat too when I'm done with it. But your era, that was a piece too that I thought sparked me, is that your generation, the iGen, the Gen Zs, whatever you guys are called.
Millennials.
Are you still a millennial? Is that?
Yeah. I'm I'm at the tail end of it. I was born in 92.
Okay. So that topic was and has been bandied about because of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he talks a lot about students born in 1995 who went through university from 2013 on. And there's good and bad with what took place within that. And what I thought was really unique is that you guys had this confluence of like Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, talking about inequality, the Tea Party on the right kind of coming in and saying, you know, we need to take back our country. You know, it was like all this stuff was kind of starting to happen.
Gender in bathrooms, Title IX. Oh, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. All that. And so you guys grew up, and again, this is just my own purview, as I think one of the most integrated groups of young men and women, where everything was just kind of coming together, and I mean integrated in the sense of information being readily available, right? You guys could access anything you want at any time, supercomputers in your pockets, and you've had them since you were kids. And so you see the world differently. And that was where the safe space discussions, I interviewed professors, one from San Francisco, University of San Francisco School of Management, so graduate program. He teaches advertising. He was a mentor of mine in the ad biz, and so that's why I knew him. And then another friend of mine who also moved into the ad biz after his time in academia at Berkeley. And so I got kind of that sense of where it was. And so what I wanted to talk with you about, and per our emails, there's a lot of things, and this is, I'd like to get your take on this, because maybe we can frame our discussion this way, is that as a liberal, you and I agree on almost everything.
Yeah.
I think you'll tilt a little bit more left than I do on certain areas. And it was actually your Facebook post on the way to a Sacramento event where you had smash the patriarchies on your jacket, and you didn't say capitalism was evil, but like there's something we need to replace it or fix it, or, you know, whatever it may be. Yeah. And I was like, okay, I got to talk to that dude, because this is kind of where we will have some spirited debate. And I'm of the belief, and this is kind of where I'm seeing this in the culture, is that there's liberals like myself, and then there's progressives, if you will, or left of liberal.
Yeah.
And then there's conservatives, friends of mine who may or may not have voted for Mr. Trump, but most likely did vote for W. And that's typical old world conservative. And then there's Trumpers, which is a very different, right?
Very different
landscape. So we almost have 4 parties now, right? And we have like 2 in each. And so that's, I think, for you and me, it can be neat to kind of frame it that way. And if you disagree, let me know.
Yeah.
With that framing, because then we can start there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a staunch progressive. I'm on the left. That doesn't mean I agree with everything on the left. There's like a common notion that liberals are so good at arguing with one another because we're so liberal with our ideas. And so, you know, I'm one of those people who, I'm very progressive with policy. I'm very progressive with what I want our institutions to be. But yeah, I mean, I'm very progressive against conservatism. I'm very progressive against Trumpism. Yeah. I do not like right-wing politics at all. And I may not like left-wing politics in terms of the establishment, in terms of the Democratic Party largely, in terms of them not acting as progressively as I would want it. But yeah, so I'm a progressive. I'm within the Democratic Party. I'm very critical of the Democratic Party, but I know that it's the best party out of the 2 parties that we have. And yeah, that's just, I'm a strong supporter of progressive policies. Of actually, you know, I'm a strong supporter of erring on the side of really bold and fundamental policies. So like one of them is like abolishing the police.
Right.
It's not that I'm radical or anything. It's more so that like we in this country, we're so far to the right compared to the rest of the world. At least we are to the Scandinavian countries, then European countries, and in Canada, and really developing, very, very, very developed countries in the West, we're incredibly far to the right. So yeah, I'm always going to err on the side of being a leftist and a progressive because, which was so far to the right. But really, I'm a social democrat at the end of the day.
Right.
I believe capitalism has pros. I believe socialism has pros, but I also believe they both have cons. So yeah, that's just a little bit of that.
Well, I think that's a great way to start. So I didn't mention that, but I also just had a interview around defund the police.
Okay.
So let's start there. I'll just admit my bias. So I studied martial arts for many years, and a lot of the guys that I did the work with and fought against and became friends with were SFPD.
Yep.
I also had a buddy who was the lieutenant in Santa Rosa for 27 years and came up from beat cop all the way through leadership. And he was in charge of 180 uniformed officers and had a storied career as a detective. And I mean, just an awesome dude, right? So that's him. And I interviewed him. And it was the same thing is that, and then I shared this too. So anyone who watched that, I apologize for the redundancy. But for me as an ad guy, which I talk about every show, is that defund the police was problematic in its language linguistically. And that was the thing for me to start off with in that sense. But you actually use the word abolish. So you're not actually mincing words.
No.
And so and my purview as of today, and it can be shifted, possibly, is that I don't, because Santa Rosa Police Department being a beacon as an example, and we admitted this in the discussion back and forth. Is this not a typical department? It's a very well-run department. It's funded. It's not a optimal department because it needs more funding specifically for mental health and those kind of things. Yeah. But they've done a very good job. And he used numbers in there, and it's from memory, so I may screw these up, but 255,000 calls into dispatch in 2019. 137,000 of those had men and women shepherded out onto the field. Yeah. 247 of those involved use of force.
Yeah.
And none of those had any loss. I mean, I'm sure they had some lawsuits and issues, but none of those were against the uniformed officers. And so it was, again, that being stated, was a very powerful example of good policing. Let's just say that. So when you say abolish, do you mean I don't even put words in it. What do you mean by abolish?
Okay, so when I say abolish police, that doesn't mean there aren't good police officers or good police departments. That's not what I'm saying. But what it is saying is our system, the way we've had it for so long, it cannot be reformed because it's rooted in racism and classism. And so what I'm advancing is to end that entire system and to reimagine what policing is from a community lens. So what does the community want? How can we frame an institution based on what the community wants rather than people, policymakers, public administrators thou become forcing down what they think is right for the community? So I think a lot of the issues with abolishing the police is just people don't really understand. Yeah, we can talk about semantics, about how it's the languages and all that stuff. But most people don't even understand what we're talking about when we're saying defund the police or when we're saying abolish the police. And I think when people actually truly understand what abolish the police is, it's just, we're not abandoning common sense. This system is not working. Our Black peers, our Hispanic, Latinx peers, our poor peers are being killed and brutalized every single day by police officers. That doesn't mean police officers are inherently bad. It just means that the institution is inherently bad because of how it started. So I just want to reimagine that. I want to have communities lead that front and to reimagine what works for them in their communities. Because all of our communities are different. Something will work in one community and something will work in another. And so And while that's hard to imagine because there's no structure with that, it's more so like, what will the communities do? That's our responsibility as citizens in a society, to figure it out ourselves, and not rely on racist classist systems. Because when we do that, we know the consequences of it.
Cool. So let me ask you this. There's 18,000 police departments in the country, approximately 1 million uniformed officers. So when you say abolish, I get that it's like reform and reinvigorate and rethink and reprioritize, all these different re's. What does it look like when, let's just say you are now in your position, right?
Yeah.
As a leader, you're out of school and you're in charge of a community. What would you do to the police department? And let's just use a single example because it's obviously too difficult to say how would you reimagine 1 million police officers. But what would you do within, I don't even know where you live, Sacramento, or a little town, Elk Grove, or some little town there that is has a 30-person force? Or what does that look like? How do you then, with the abolishment word, how does that play out? What is the actual, tactics and strategies there?
Well, as someone that's not so familiar with the abolitionist mentality on police, I can't really give you specifics. But what I do think is, we don't have to, like, I'll give one example just to make this very relevant and something that I'm familiar with. So when we're abandoning fossil fuels, we completely destroyed the Midwest. We took all those jobs away. We were trying to introduce renewables. What we should have done is we should have grabbed all those people that were working in fossil fuels and we should have trained them into renewable energies. And then voila, the job just shifts from one to another. And I imagine the same thing with police is
education.
Yeah, education and training into a new style of policing based on what the community wants. And so, the initial thing is not just ending police right away. You would have to engage with the community. You would have to have town halls. You would have to survey what the community wants. What are the things that they don't like? What are the things they do like? How can we frame the community policing in their lens? And then from there, we adjust away from our system of policing to the new system. And it's just in a very organic process. So, and again, I can't give one way of doing that because communities are all different.
Yep.
But yeah, it's not just saying, oh, police are over and we have nothing. It's more so transitioning away from it, based on what the community wants. And so,
is that a federal oversight? Or state oversight, or city oversight, or how does that look as far as that?
Well, I think police power is reserved to states, so it's a state and local matter. That doesn't mean the federal government doesn't give funding to state and local police.
Yeah,
they do.
Yeah.
In the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, she highlights that very well, and really how federal funding has actually increased the militarization of police, which isn't good.
Well, that's the 1033 stuff, right? Yeah. When I talked about that too. So yeah, and so that's another example. My buddy said, just Google LA tanks. And what you do when you Google LA tanks is that they have these armored vehicles for hostage rescue and negotiation. Yeah. And I pointed this out to him. I said, yeah, dude, but there was a tank in Keene, New Hampshire at a pumpkin festival based on the 1033 initiative. And he laughed because it was there. And I said, that's also part of the problem.
Yeah.
When you see something that egregious.
Yeah. And we have that. And then most of our police departments don't have body cameras.
Well, and that was another discussion. So up until 2018, it was not funded. So it wasn't even the police.
Yeah.
And by the way, all my buddies that I've talked to about this in the police department have said the same thing. When they first got the cameras, they were pissed. They're like, well, imagine someone telling you that we're going to put a camera on you, Joey, and we're going to watch you work all day. And I was like, well, I don't do anything. So I'd be really boring.
Well, hey, if the public, if the taxpayers are funding my salary, then sure.
Well,
I'm bound to the people.
Very good point. The reason I share that is because 2 years later, they will not go to work without them.
Yes.
Right. So they don't feel safe.
Security. Yes.
So that has happened in a good way. But that goes back to what I think the bigger issue is all my buddies said that the current funding is well underfunded, like everything to do with their departments.
Yeah, sure.
So the 1033 stuff didn't even hit Santa Rosa because in that there were bayonets and all this weird stuff that was just crazy. And that is part of the problem. And we also agree on media being just awful as it relates to narrative and misinformation and bullshit. Yeah. And so what I was trying to get to with the police stuff was that, and I think my friend John, the former lieutenant, he's just retired. He would say the same thing you're saying, like bring in the community and have them say, hey, this is what we want to do. Because when you have 137,000 calls in 1 year where you're sending your men and women out to, which by the way, the majority of which are mental health, domestic violence, harming of oneself. And a lot of these folks are repeat visitors. So like they know, exactly. They see the address on their screen. They're like, oh, there we go. That's John and Barbara. The fight.
As a social worker, I experience it every single day. I mean, and
that's the classism issue.
Yeah,
right?
Well, it's a classism issue. But I think I just wanted to add to. I just wanted to emphasize it. The policing has to come from the community. So I don't want. There's still a power dynamic when police departments invite the community, because at the end of the day, the people who are going to be making the decision are the police departments. So they can engage with the communities and they can get their input, which is great because that's what we want. That's how we build community. But again, reimagining police to me is it has to come from the community.
So you flip it on its head then. Yeah. In that sense, you invite the police to hear what you're going to do.
Yes. And then that doesn't mean that like, and the structure comes from within the community. There's a reason why, at least in Sacramento, why most of the police in Sacramento, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure, I haven't looked at the data too in depth. But there's a reason why in a lot of police departments, most of the police officers are not actually from the communities that they're policing, and why there's so much tension. Because if a police officer is engaging in a community and they brutalize people, and then they can drive home in a rural environment or a suburban environment, leaving that environment, they're not connected to community, and they're not going to have that sense of community. And so being part of a community is so important. And that.
So there's no laws in Sacramento, because San Francisco, you have to live in proper to be an SF cop. Santa Rosa too. So I don't know how they do it. And I guess that's another piece to me, is that there are really good police departments out there. I mean, thousands of them. Yeah. And there's some really dog shit, horribly racist.
Like LA?
Fundamentally. Well, there's just too many. Like it's like LA. I haven't done.
I was reading a report that a report came out about LA and them having like mobster gang affiliations within the police department. I was just like, oh my gosh. Like,
well, see, I can't speak to that. I have done some homework on Ferguson and some areas that actually had investigations that proved corruption, right? At the core, like all the way through the leadership. And so that's those, and this is all my buddies feel the same way. They detest these men and women as much as we do, because they ruin their lives as peace officers. And
well, they detest them, but they keep them within the institutions, which is like, again,
but that's what I'm saying. That the problem in these circumstances has a lot to do with geography to begin with. It's not, and so all I'm saying is that this is kind of what I'm attempting to do with these conversations in general, is that we're not that far apart. You know what I mean? But the media makes us to be just polarized, and all cops are shitty, and all cops are great. And you're like, well, no, it's there's a space in between there. And that's exactly what my buddies are telling me from leadership. So it's like, I think and I would agree that having more community involved, because Minneapolis is saying actually abolish the police. Parts of Portland and Seattle are saying get rid of them, and we're going to start something. And then Chaz, if you remember, had this utopian week. They came out and they had no police zone, and it was peace and love and Bob Marley and all the cool stuff going on for a week. And I remember my buddies in Portland taking pictures and showing me stuff. Like, look how beautiful this is. And I'm like, that's so cool. Because as a liberal, you're like, look at that. They figured it all out. Good for them,
But they didn't, right?
No, because then 6 days later, there was 4 murders and rapes, and it was fucked up. And so you're like, okay, and who'd they call in? Well, the mayor called in the police. Yes. And so you're like, okay. And so that's one of those things where police are necessary. And by the way, what my buddies have always said is that they are the cheapest labor possible to deal with all of the problems of a city.
Even more than teachers?
No, in the sense that anything that's going wrong, you 911, you call the police, right?
Yeah.
And that means that like they're not mental health experts. They're not social workers. They're not psychiatrists. They're not psychologists. They don't understand necessarily how to deal with this. And de-escalation training touches on that, which he talked about. Yeah. But what my buddy in leadership said is that there's tons more money needed for training. There's tons more money needed for individual psychology for each individual officer because they go through a shitload of PTSD type issues, right? They see the worst of our society on a daily basis. And whether or not they're engaged in gun battle isn't even the point. They see death and people, pooping on themselves and punching each other and hurting each other. And they see the absolute worst of humanity on a daily basis. And that has an effect. And he said, my men and women need more therapy. They need more training. They need more all of this. And so that is, I think, where if we could get together as a culture, we could figure these things out because it's not about defunding or abolishing, really, if we want to get into the semantics. It's actually about, and I don't know what the word is. Hopefully we could find a word that we agree on, like, not reimagining, but clean slate.
I'm gonna push back on that because it's not a semantic issue for me. It's a straight up police.
No, we have to find a word. That's what I'm saying. But it's not about abolishing. Even what you described isn't about abolishing.
But it is because we're getting rid of a system. We're not like when we talk about, Bernie Sanders came out, one of the most progressive senators, if not the most progressive senator in Congress. Yeah. He came out and said, we need to fund the police actually more. Yeah. And I understood why he said that. But what I'm saying is we need to end police and we need to fund other things. So, for example...
But you're not saying you end... We're not eliminating police officers. That's what I'm saying. What you're saying is that we're ending the institution.
In a way... So you know how you were talking about mental health calls and how police weren't trained for that?
Yeah.
Get rid of that for police.
Well, that's what my buddies want too.
Like fund mental health. Yeah, exactly. Fund mental health workers. And if mental health workers can't de-escalate a situation, then they can call the police in like a violent situation. Right. But it's like it's not even. It's adding a lot more funding for mental health issues, for homelessness, for like even eviction like processes, rather than police just coming there and
the sheriff, right?
Yep. Where it's more so like family, like the court comes and they have a representative, and so I want to. So when I say defund the police, I'm actually saying take money away from the police and spend money in other segments of society, other sectors of society, nonprofits and social workers and courts and so take away. So because I do think like police officers do get PTSD. Like you were absolutely right when you said they see the worst. As a social worker, I see the worst too. It's like awful. But they're doing too much. And so when we add more funding, we're not actually addressing the problem of them doing too much. We're giving them more resources to do too much. And they're doing too much. And so, I think they should be there for the worst case scenarios. So mass shootings,
domestic violence, robbery, burglaries, car theft, those kind of things. And that's what they want to do as well. That's what I'm saying. And I'm not poo-pooing your theory on some. I'm just saying the semantics for me as a word guy, right? Someone who got paid. I got paid for 20 years to move words around on pages, right? Because words actually matter. And so that's what I'm saying is that it doesn't matter, or it does matter what we call it, right? It's the same kind of thing where when you use words that don't necessarily apply, it's a fundamental problem, because then when you say defund to somebody, they say, so eliminate? Because that's what it means.
Yeah. Well,
as opposed to recalibrating.
Honestly, it might be eliminating, because at the end of the day, what if a community says we don't even want police to have firearms, and we actually don't even want police to deal with the most violent? We feel that social workers are the best at dealing with that situation. Then that is eliminating police, and that's
but that's a different situation then, because that's not what I heard you say originally. Was you're saying that we want police to be there in exigent circumstance when stuff goes sideways? I would want that.
Yeah.
I live in San Francisco,
and I think that's, you know, honestly, that was probably a slip up on my end, because yeah, I don't think a lot of communities, particularly those that are for abolishing the police, the most prominent activists, and yeah, I don't think they speak the same language as I would in that instance. So
you would think that they actually want no police.
And yeah, I'm actually open, and I'm actually open-minded to that, because as a social worker, so I'll give you one story as a social worker. So before I became a case manager at my program, I was a crisis interventionist worker. So I would deal with crises at my site. One night, I had a resident come, Zach, there's two clients fighting, one with a hammer, one with a knife. We had a security guard there. The security guard dealt with the situation. We both actually dealt with the situation by using our voices. Security guard did have to use force at one point, but they didn't have a firearm, and they could only use their bodies at that point. And then I was using my voice to de-escalate. So we de-escalated the entire incident. Both of the residents were in their home, and we de-escalated by separating them physically and by using our voices. In the meantime, police were called. Dude, bro, like this is what we're talking about. I had two officers running like it was a war zone, one with the shotgun, one with the semi-automatic, pointing the guns, like running in to straight up shoot people. And I, as a social worker yes, I learned on the job, but I don't have like professional training in de-escalation in the sense that I go to these trainings and I have a certificate. I don't have that. I had to de-escalate these officers myself. And so when I finally de-escalated them, we ended up figuring out that I had to call property management because I was trying to get a key to then open up the door, because the officers had to go in and arrest the person who had a knife and who had started the fight. And so, but I had to de-escalate that. We ended up figuring out the way. They did have to kick the door down because we couldn't find the key. But still, when they ran in there, it was like,
you guys inside the house when they came in?
No, we were outside in the courtyard. So I couldn't get the key. They had to kick down the door because one of the person that they were trying to get to essentially arrest was inside their own home. And so they kicked down the door, and it was like a straight up, like, you know, when you see those movie squats and they run in and they're shouting and they're like pointing their guns at people and they're saying, get down.
Get on the floor.
That's what they did. So while I did de-escalate them, as a social worker, you don't do that. Like, this person has mental health issues. This person was on drugs. And this person wasn't really violent. They were just reacting to a very to an issue that escalated really quickly. But we had de-escalated. They went inside their home and they were calm. But these officers just ran in and escalated this whole situation like it was a freaking hostage takeover, a hostage rescue. And so that's what I'm talking about. Like,
so let me back up for a sec. So you guys de-escalated. It was in the front yard or something with these two?
Yeah, so they were fighting in the front yard in front of both of her. They were neighbors. Yep. They were fighting in front of her houses. And then I came out. I de-escalated with my voice. Security guard separated one of them, and then they both got put inside their homes.
And then who called the police? Neighbors?
One of the residents.
Okay. And so after you guys de-escalated, they went back to their home. Each of them.
Yeah, one of them was out. But the one that the officers were trying to arrest was inside her home.
Locked in his house. Was it a he or she?
Yeah, because I asked another resident to take that person in their home.
Got it. And so at this point, and this is what my buddy would tell me, is that's where the body cameras come in. So police officers, when they get out of their car, activate their body camera.
Yeah.
They activate the body camera. Did they come and talk to you first?
No, they came and ran
right past you guys
with their guns.
Okay.
And I had They were running straight at the scene, and I had to say, calm the hell down.
Got it. And so was that on camera, or did they not have their cameras on?
I don't think they had their body cameras. I didn't see.
So there's an example of that officer, according to my buddy, Lieutenant.
But actually, Joey,
those guys would be in trouble.
I don't know if they had their body cameras or not.
Let's just say they did.
Yeah.
Then what they did was against the de-escalation training they go through as police officers. And what they did was wrong. And what they did was possibly illegal, not even protected under qualified immunity. So all of those things that you described are wrong. Period. There's no gray area there. And that's why I would ask, and he would say the same thing, as in my buddy's tears, like those dickheads are ruining it for everyone, because those guys they should not be cops with that kind of mentality and that kind of behavior, period.
Well, and Joey, when they came, I de-escalated them. Then, because I was able to de-escalate them and time was passing, then there was probably about 6 officers at that point. I'm sure there was a leader of the group, and they still continued that aggressive, escalating mentality.
No, I mean, that sucks to hear, because it's wrong and it's stupid.
Well, and I feel like it's really it's an outcome.
Okay, but let's just and we can get off this topic, because I agree with you. And so what I'm saying, and the reason I shared those numbers with you on Santa Rosa is because they're fresh in my brain, but 247 of those out of the 137,000 actual dispatched units had use of force. And so what my buddies always say is that if the police aren't perfect, we're bad. And that is a narrative. I would agree that, and I would just say this, depending on how small the community is, maybe there should be this level of approach. And I don't know, again, Elk Grove, one of my college buddies lives there now. It seems like a little quiet town. Maybe you could start a prototype, if you will, and say, hey, we're not going to have any police officers. Program. Yeah, we're not going to have any police officers at all. And so we're going to have social workers and psychologists and I don't even know what you'd call people, but de-escalation force for all of these pieces, for mental health, for domestic abuse, domestic violence. And then what happens when there's actual robberies, burglaries, shootings? Do you call departments outside of that, Gio? I mean, those are all questions that we could solve, but I think that may be, for me, I would love to see something in practice that we could point to and say, all right, you know what? Because the utopian vision, we can get into that too with capitalism, is that when you start to look at we need to replace it. I'm like, all right, well, cool. I don't think you can remove police officers. That's just, and I'm always open-minded, but I just haven't seen it. And all the research I've done, I can't imagine it. San Francisco, as an example, our DA decided that you could walk into Walgreens and steal shit and it's not a crime. And so people started doing it. And now all Walgreens are shut off here in the city because people walked in and just started stealing stuff and just walked out and just flipped the bird to the cashier. And then the security guard, who's making $10 an hour, is not going to put his life in danger to take care of people that are walking out with, $40 worth of product. It was just like, no, I'm not doing that, man. So I'm not of the belief that our society is polite enough that it could deal with this utopian vision. I hear what you're saying, and I know you come from a great place and an educated place. That's why I brought you on. But I think I'm definitely, and what my friends have also said is that there is a wonderful opportunity to mesh with the communities, to talk what that looks like. They don't want money for tanks, just so you know. They want money for mental health and social. They do. And they've said this for years. And the fact that my buddy, because he was in leadership, was the liaison with all of the mental health pieces in Sonoma County, he knew firsthand how underfunded these budgets were. He even said that they had eight mental health beds out of 500,000 people in the county. So he said, when you go out to these mental health problems, whether the domestic violence or mental health or trying to harm themselves, whatever they're trying to do, they have 8 beds. And he said, so one night you could exhaust the opportunity of Sonoma County in one shift with maybe 30 of your force out there. So there's a huge problem with our culture. And I don't think the police get enough credit. That's just my 2 cents. So let's go to this. one thing I think we can agree on, the CRT piece, how critical, probably a funny word there, how critical is critical race theory in the sense that I'm a big believer that we have systemic racism in our culture. And when I read the literature and the stories all the way back, we used to exchange these on Facebook too. Some great books when James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates and all the people that have done a really good job of capturing their specific plight in story form. Obviously, Medgar Evers and MLK and Malcolm X and all the leaders of this telling their stories and being very prolific in their writing and sharing of story, because narratives create an understanding in our culture, right? Yep. And for me, I have so many friends, conservative too. And I'm not talking like Trumpers, but conservative people that just don't believe that white privilege exists and that there is no systemic racism. And the arguments are right off of Fox News. We have a former president that was black. We have executives that are black. We have, a secretary of defense today that is black. So it's it. We're good. You're like, no, we're not good. And not on any front. And what I didn't realize until I started diving into literature is that critical race theory isn't just about the legal discussions that formed by, Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell in the 70s as legal scholars to discuss.
Yeah.
It's also about Latinx. It's also about Asian. It's just any type of minority that is oppressed is part of that program, right? So just for any listener who has, what we're talking about critical race theory and where the debate is in the news, critical race theory is a legal scholarship that founded in the 70s by Kimberly and Derek Bell. And she actually founded the term, I think, Kimberly Crenshaw. And so it was a bunch of legal scholars, people of your ilk, pontificating about like, hey, this is wrong. And this is, we need to fix this. And we need to identify these things. And we need to find remedies for these things. And we need to do this. And that started in the 70s. And it pretty much remained at that level, right? High-end academia, scholars, and people of letters talking about this as a necessary reimagining of how we view the population, how we deal with the problems based on all of these pieces. What you see in the narrative today, specifically from the right, is that we're teaching this to K through 12, which is not the case at all. But what I did find out is that there's mechanisms of critical race theory that are now in the criteria and the syllabi of teachers. So it is being taught. It's just not critical race theory is so academic that it can't be taught to my son, who's, I have two kids, they're 8 and 9. So they're not teaching my little boys critical race theory because if it doesn't have somebody with Legos or Iron Man, they're probably not interested. And so there's those two pieces just to like set the table.
Yep.
How do you as a progressive see, and maybe let's just focus on one aspect that I have, because as a corporate coach, I have executives that I coach.
Yeah.
A lot of them are dealing with intersectionality. So we could just focus on that piece maybe as a starter. The problem that they and I have seen with that kind of goes back to another woman who's in the zeitgeist, is Robin DiAngelo's book, which we both talked about and read.
Oh, yeah.
White Fragility. And not even admitting, but opening up a lot of these intersectionality training courses by telling folks in the room that we are all racists. And I will admit that I have implicit bias on race. I just have. I grew up with my parents. My dad was a bigot. My grandparents were bigots. And specific to, I think my dad was pretty much a xenophobe, but he thought he was better than black people for sure. Yep. And my mom was Mexican. So I don't think whether he thought he was better than Mexicans or not, I don't know, but she was adopted. So she wasn't raised in the culture, but I digress. So when you look at teaching this to corporate executives, and maybe that's the only experience I have right now, is that they're on their heels. They're like, wow, you walk into a room full of really powerful men and women and tell them they're racist. That's pretty much the end of the story, right? It doesn't go over well. And in certain educational institutions in big corporate America, I think there's 26 out of the Fortune 100 for sure that are teaching intersectionality training. And I got that data from Christopher Rufo. And we are teaching this in our culture. So the approach to me seems wrong. And it kind of goes back to the defund the police discussion. I think if we had a polite debate around things, I think we could solve the problems much easier. What do you think of intersectionality training? Because I think we can agree that the purpose of it is the right thing, but how it's being discussed and how it's being taught seems to me problematic. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I want to say one thing. You know how you said pilot program for rethinking about police? There is one. I know of one program in Oregon. I was trying to look it up, but I'll find it and I'll send that to you.
Thank you.
As to see it, because it is a very successful program, and it could be something that we can model off of. But in terms of CRT and in terms of intersectionality, I just wanted to add one thing. So I think there's three ways I define CRT. The first way is a very technical academic way, which is legal scholars talking about how legal institutions reinforce racism and how it's normal. The second aspect of CRT would be MOK, really all the narratives by scholars, by activists that have essentially taught us essentially narratives against white supremacy. So Chicano studies, African American studies, all these things, Native American studies, indigenous people studies. So that's the second one. And then the third one is culture, how people define it, how people say, oh my God, you're learning about MOK, that's critical race theory. So
you're learning basic history. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why when you look at the Texas statute that came out banning CRT, they removed Native American studies, they removed MOK, they removed
Chinese and the Japanese internment camps, all that. Yeah.
Whenever the founding fathers had essays about slavery and how it was wrong, we can't even learn about the KKK, about how bad they were.
Right.
So that's
is this just isolated to Texas, by the way, or is this? It sounds very Texan.
It's very well. We do know that it was a Texas statute that was just enacted. I haven't looked at, but that was probably the most popular one that I know of. I did hear you say Chris Rufo. So that guy sucks. And the reason why I say he sucks is because he is the leading advocate against CRT.
Oh, I know. That's why I've done my homework on him, because I'm trying to get the other side. And that's a piece I think we were talking about earlier is for me to understand or for me to do anything of value. Yeah. I need to understand the other person's purview. And that is huge. And Christopher Rufo is a very educated person on this area. He's a journalist. He's a thinker. I don't necessarily agree with him, but the guy's done unbelievable homework. I mean, it's not like he's actually done records requests.
I think he's being incredibly disingenuous, and I think he has a political agenda for CRT, and I think that's why he's rather than actually talking about the first two definitions of CRT, which is academic, and actually
you're right. He's talking about
creating this whole narrative that it's in our schools, that it's and a lot of people would argue that once you follow the money, it's actually a way to promote homeschooling. But that's a whole other thing.
No, that's cool. I would just say that the reason I bring Christopher Rufo into the discussion is that it's the same reason I would bring Ben Shapiro into the discussion. It has nothing to do with the fact that I look up to them or
Of course.
It's just that I because they're thinkers, and those are the thinkers that are being paid attention to by the right. And so for me, I need to understand. If my friend says, have you seen Christopher Rufo? I'm like, no. So then I looked him up and I was like, oh, okay.
And to be objective and to, of course. My buddy, he actually had a debate against Charlie Kirk. And they talked about CRT. So I'll share that.
I thought we were good. Yeah, we saw that online because Charlie Kirk, I can't get my arms around. I try to see, he maybe has this point. I'm like, no, he doesn't.
But he actually conceded. He conceded that the technical, the academic, the first definition of CRT was actually right, which was crazy.
Wow.
For progressive.
Good for your buddy. Yeah.
And so they were mostly debating the third one, which
was the narrative.
Sees it. Yes, correct. The narrative, cultural narrative. So I'll share that link as well.
That's cool for Charlie, that's why you can't poo-poo everyone.
But as to intersectionality, yeah, it's tough. I think the really the best way to have intersectionality is to actually be an integrated society, because when we see it, we are it. So that's the best case scenario. The next best case scenario is learning intersectionality in public education. So learning history, as we pointed out, which includes African American history, which includes Chicano history, which includes Indigenous history, Asian API history. So that's our second best approach. And what's happening right now is largely white conservative men and really white conservative people, Americans, are pushing back against learning about intersectionality, learning about non-white people, and in their schools. So that's why we had that Texas statute getting rid of pretty much every angle of intersectionality that they were being taught. Did they get rid of any history on white people? The only history that they got
the bad
rid of,
history. Yeah.
Oh no, the only history that they got rid of for white people was when they talked about intersectionality.
Right.
So it's like, yeah. So in terms of intersectionality, I think it's just one of those things where we have to live it and we have to be taught it. And we're taught it right now because we don't live it. And obviously a very conservatism response to that is fundamentalism.
Concern. And this is where I think my progressive friends push too far, because the word white supremacy, which is in all of the literature, is an immediate on your heels reaction from people. And so I shared with my buddy in a 2-hour CRT debate, the author and Black DEI consultant. I said, Bud, like, if someone came to me and told me I was racist, I would immediately recoil. It's almost like someone calling me a pedophile. It's a really toxic label. And so I would push against that, even if I was. And then I explained to him an example of implicit bias, where a buddy of mine and I were hanging out in New York City at a conference, and he's a Black guy.
Yeah.
And we saw a guy get out of a Range Rover in the lobby, and he was dressed to the nines, tall and handsome. And my buddy goes, "Is that a baller or a tech CEO?" And I was like, "Oh, fuck. Sorry. I would think he was a baller," right? I mean, it was just my first reaction. And he goes, "Okay, well, thanks for being honest, buddy." And to me, that was an example for me. And this was my buddy being nice, but trying to point out the obvious. Like, we have implicit bias. And this was my example. I have 3 or 4 people already comment on this, like, "You're a racist. I'm not." I'm like, okay, that's fair. But that was just how I was. And I made a joke. My wife is Chinese and my kids are half Chinese. And so I made a joke once to, I don't know, it was my wife's friend who's Chinese. We were at 7-Eleven and there's a Chinese guy behind the counter. And I saw his poor mom, and that was a racist comment, because growing up in this Chinese family over the last 13 years, I've watched Chinese mothers and my children go to a Chinese Mandarin immersion school. And I see the doting of the mothers, and I see how education is number one, and where you go to school, where you get a job, and how it's more important than where I grew up. Right? My mom's Latina. They don't have the same, focus on education. So I have these biases. I just do. And so that, to me, is when I come up with that on my own, it's easier for me to swallow. Let me just say that. And when someone comes in to teach a class, and I might even start doing this, at some point with my consulting, because it's about the approach. It's if you go in and tell people, specifically white men, I'll just say that, I'm not even white officially, but I am under the moniker of, I get all the privilege of my appearance and all of that. But if someone came in as a consultant that I hired for my team when I was running an ad agency, I'd be on my heels. And I'd probably have to apologize to my team and say, you know what, that didn't work. This isn't going to work. And if I had to have it, because it was mandated by my, we were a small agency. We weren't owned by another company. But if I worked for a holding company, and that holding company said, your agency needs to have this training and you need to put in these continuing education hours, I would do it, but I'd be pissed. And it would push me in the wrong direction, dude. So that's my question is like, we have to work on the approach. And this is where my buddy and I, the CRT consultant, agreed 100%. We agreed that racism is systemic. We agreed that it's a huge problem. We agreed that our history is not being taught correctly. But intersectionality is one example. And the language that Robin DiAngelo uses, to me, seems really divisive. And it's going to fuck us up.
Yeah.
And that's just that's my purview. And I can be talked off this ledge. To me, that's how I see it.
So that's just one little side note. But as to semantics, as to how we approach it, it's hard for me because when we're in a position of privilege, whether we're white passing or whether we're white, whether we identify as being white, because it's all up to what we identify as. It's much easier for me as a white man to say, oh, you can't say white supremacy, because that affects me. And when we talk white fragility, that upsets me and that makes me upset. And you can't come at me like that. And I get people have emotions and I get these things, but at the same time, to me, it's just hard. It's hard to try to figure out a way to be sensitive to white people when white supremacy is not sensitive and actually kills people. And actually it is.
But true, but you think about white supremacy, the immediately what conjures up in your brain is KKK and lynchings and bigotry and death. And so when you go and tell an executive that their beliefs are white supremacy on a foundation of white supremacy, that's what they conjure up in their head too. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that the history itself isn't, it's painfully clear. But all I'm saying is that the approach is very, very, to me, off-putting.
Yeah.
And that's where, and it's the same belief I have in defund the police. It's those words don't fucking work. So if they don't work, it doesn't matter if we're accused of being white and fragile, because I have no problem with that. I know that.
How about this? MLK. He was the easiest example of approaching it the right way, and it didn't work. So that is what I'm saying. Regardless of their approach, whether you're nonviolent, whether you're using all the right words, it's not working. And so that's why I want to be firm with calling it what it is. And I feel like when we're sensitive to white people and how they feel, even these CEOs, we don't actually address the problem. We shy away from it. And we actually devalue the problem because we're not using the language that, like, we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to call it white supremacy, because when Black people are being killed left and right, they cannot address that until we actually call it for what it is. Like the Texas bill, that was one of the most racist bills in Texas history, like by far. And so we can say that those legislators had good intentions, and we can say that they feel like they feel. Well, I'm just trying to.
No, I know you mean.
Trying to be the devil's advocate. Yeah. We can say all these things that they're human beings and that they're not actually bad people, and I probably believe that actually. But what are the consequences? What are the outcomes of that? Well, students aren't going to learn about the KKK anymore.
Well, yes.
They literally aren't going to learn about the KKK anymore. It's literally the legislation says you cannot talk bad about the KKK.
No, I get it. I read that and it's gross. Yeah. But my point, and this goes back to the education piece.
Yeah.
So to fight against my own argument that we need to be, right, is that because Richard Delgado, and that's a book we shared on CRT, he wrote that the impatience with liberalism, the reader will recall that CRT takes liberalism to task for its cautious, incremental qualities. That's me, liberal. I'm not going far enough, right? And its radical measures are in order, otherwise the system merely swallows up the same, it swallows up the same premiums one has made and eventually goes back to the way it was. So the progress that is being made, if it's not radical, doesn't work. And so I get that. And my buddy Dex Devlin Ross, my CRT buddy on the show, who is immersed in this, said the same thing to me, because I said the far left is hurting the cause with some of these language issues and some of those pushing too far. And he said, Joey, it's just like Malcolm X and MLK. He said Malcolm X did his thing because it helped MLK do his. So he goes, your buddies on the far left are helping you because they're pushing it so far that even when we do settle on an area, it's further to the left than it was previous. And so I get that. Okay. So that was something I just learned in the last 2 weeks, because I was so mad about the kids at Evergreen College and how they went crazy on Brett Weinstein. And that example just infuriated me because...
And by the way, that's not to endorse violence or anything like that.
No. I don't think you did it for a second. I just wanted to explain that, because the fact that the Texas bill, as a really stunning example of ignorance, that's not what I'm talking about. The fact that we need to teach history to our children. Like, for me personally, whether my kids get that in school, they will get it from me. They will be reading these books on critical race theory. They'll be reading African history. They'll be reading Latino history. They'll be reading all of these pieces because they have to understand. And by the way, I'm also going to teach them that this is a pilot program that we're still in, right? Democracy is 200 years old here, 250 years old, but it's young. And so let's also be kind to the Americans. Let's be kind to where we are. Let's appreciate the progress we've made, those kind of things. But they have to know all of it. And that is the fulcrum to every discussion that we've kind of highlighted, whether it's intersectionality, whether it's defund the police, whether it's capitalism, whether it's patriarchies. All of these big complex topics are so deep that the more I dive in, the more lost I get. Because I'm like, holy shit, that was a good point. But I do agree with everything you're saying on the educational front. I'm just saying that, here's the example. It's the approach. So one approach is segregating white people from black people in these training sessions. Do you see that as beneficial? Because I don't.
Well, I think we have to. I think it's white people's responsibility to educate white people and to challenge white people. And to say you are a white supremacist. Not you particularly, but not you particularly, but in that scenario, because we've relied on non-white people to constantly educate us, and we don't fucking learn. Sorry for the language.
I'll give you that. Don't worry. I swear all the time. Don't worry.
And so, like, even me, like, I'm very, 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 very ignorant to racism. I'm, as a progressive, as someone who literally wrote my thesis on affirmative action faculty in higher education, and then trying to understand the racial dynamic of that. So I am incredibly ignorant to racism. And so generally my thing is I will defer to scholars who actually experience racism. So that doesn't mean that there aren't, that doesn't mean that white people can experience racism within a particular community that isn't white. But I'm more talking about the structure and the system, of racism. And so to back to your question, I think, it's weird because I'm not for segregation, because it would contradict what it would just contradict what I said earlier about the fact that we need to live together to understand one another.
Yep.
But at the same time, I'll say that white people need to educate one another, and there's going to have to be a far left and very strong anti-racist white people to educate other white people. And they're going to have to use strong language like that because, some people would even argue that pushback about semantics is actually white supremacy trying to preserve itself.
I could see that argument, but I'm just saying that for me, it would bristle. I would bristle at that because white supremacy has a connotation.
Yeah.
It's Ku Klux Klan. It's dickheads in fucking pointy hats and on horses and lynchings and all the bad stuff that comes up in my head And so I would say that we have,
but Joey,
bias.
maybe it's, and that's what I want to get away from. Racism is not just overt like that. White supremacy.
I get that. I understand, but that's where the training is coming in, right?
Yeah.
It's can you call, and again, I don't know the words to be, but implicit bias seems to work for me. And microaggressions, I think, are a redundancy with implicit bias because
microaggression is racism. According to Kendi. I'm reading his book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, and it's just, if you haven't read that, I highly recommend it.
It's great.
I recommend it for your audience because it's like the chapters are so easy, they're short and they're easy to understand, and it's like, I'm like, oh my God, this is like easy to like learn. It's pretty.
But my brother said the same thing because in Safe Space, the Jonathan Haidt's book and Greg Lukianoff's book, they talk about microaggressions and how it's an issue around triggers and all of these pieces on the campuses. And what they use is an example where if you're walking down the street as a white female and you clutch your purse because you see two young black men walking towards you, that's a microaggression. And if someone asks you, where are you from? You know, like my wife is Chinese. And so like my cousins actually asked her, what do you people eat? That's what they asked her when we went to Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And so my brother is a liberal academic scholar, family law attorney. So he deals with the same thing you deal with, just people in turmoil and poverty, and it's awful. And he said the same thing as Toon did. He said, it's not a microaggression, it's blatant racism, right? And so
it's a microcosm of the big issue.
Yes, but you just don't even get it, right? But that is different than going in and telling an executive at intersectionality training that he is a white supremacist. That's my point, dude. It's just,
but honestly,
I just don't think it's going to work.
Well, absolutely. You're being realistic and I'm being idealistic.
I get it. And there's maybe some middle in there because I'm just saying that even if I went and became a DEI consultant, which is something that I may even do because I really love this topic. And to your point and my friend's point, the reason he gave me the book or the reason he sent the book to his friends is that he wanted his white male friends' point of view. Like, what are you guys going to do to help this? Because you guys are privileged, because you do have a good life, because you didn't have to do
it's our responsibility.
I agree. And I can take that without being offended.
Yeah.
I can also admit that I don't have, the Louis C.K. joke was that if you could, before he jerked off on himself and ruined his name, his joke was that he said if every year.
Sorry. I had to spend a moment to laugh at that. I can't.
So, because one of my favorite jokes about white privilege is that he said if you had to re-up at the end of every year.
Yeah.
And you had all the boxes, white, Latino, black, Asian, you just white and then male. You'd be like, because in our society, it has benefits. It's not a debate. Specifically, no. I mean, it's not a debate. It's one that's contentious because people are like, well, I didn't. And I have buddies that tell me this all the time. They work their asses off. They're artisans, like carpenters, whatever they're doing for a living. So they're busting.
By the way,
ass.
It's not a debate for the left. It's still a debate for the right.
Correct. But they'll say, I have no privilege as a white man. I'm like, all right, well, cool. You didn't have the same hurdles. There's not a lot of black carpenters in your, are there? Because I don't know. But if he got there, he had to come over different hurdles than you did to get there. That's the point. And so I think that the idea is, it's the approach is how it goes. And we can just kind of end that topic there because I think we are in agreement. Patriarchies. That to me, as a patriarch, as someone who's benefited from the patriarchy.
Yep.
How do you define it? Because again, I study a lot of people on the right so that I have an argument, so I understand the arguments. A lot of the arguments are framed around if females are now part of the patriarchy, is it still a patriarch? That's a question because there's a lot of leadership, specifically in academia, but is female. If you look at humanities and social sciences, that is predominantly female now. And another thing here would be cool.
Social work.
Well, pretty much every field that deals with compassion and empathy is more dominated by females, right? And if you look at things, computer code, dudes, engineering, dudes, medicine, dudes, still, it's moving in the right direction that way. But there was an article in the Wall Street Journal recently that talked to, and I wrote this down because I didn't want to screw it up. Okay. In 2021, college campuses, women made up 59.5% of college students. Men were 40.5%. And if the trend continues by the end of the decade, it'll be 2/3 of the student body will be female. So is that good news for you on the patriarchy front? Is because now they're starting to talk about how do we recruit men back to universities? So, I mean, what does that look like to you?
I think, okay, so in my mind, what a patriarchy means is a system that is male oriented, meaning it benefits men.
Catholic Church, right?
I mean, really. I mean, if you look at all of our, really every single one of our institutions, it's largely led by men. Even higher education. So when we look at faculty, when we look at
even the NAACP, that was in Derek Bell's literature.
Yeah, so patriarchy transcends race.
Black men. It wasn't black women. It was black men.
Exactly. So patriarchy in my mind is it's just a matter of men benefiting more than everyone else. Now, as to women being more representative in higher education, I can see how that's a concern, because if we're actually feminists, we're for equality for all genders.
Right.
So, but what is the reason of going to higher education? A major reason is for economic reasons. And when we look at economics, men make far more money than women do. And I think I looked, it was like 83 cents to the dollar for income, and it was 33 cents to the dollar for wealth. So when we talk about wealth and when we talk about income, men still make far more money than women.
Yep.
And we may be able to disaggregate that and explain that, in other parts of the country, more women are stay-at-home women. And so the husband may make more money, and then that may deal with, but even in places like California, there's still that wage disparity and that wealth disparity. So I think while it's something to take into account and make sure that if we're going to be feminists, we need to promote equality for everyone. And so we need to make sure that we're putting in the same amount of effort for men and women, and for people who don't subscribe to the gender dichotomy. So I think that's always paramount. That's the only way we can fight against patriarchy, is to look from an equity lens, from an equality lens, and from being inclusive and fair with everyone else. But do I think that's that says that we're less patriarchy? No, because again, when we look at economics, when we look at politics, when we look at who's represented in Congress, in local governments, in state governments, and when we look at power, men hold that like no other, particularly old white men. So
I don't think there's any argument there. My question on the equality front, specifically to gender and incomes, there are very, very cogent arguments that involve univariate analysis versus multivariate analysis.
Yep.
Right. And so for my industry in advertising, we never did anything in a univariate analysis. So when someone says this woman makes more than this guy, your first question is, all right, cool. Do they have the same job? Yes. So fuck you. It's the same job. She's making less. Right. Like, okay. So do they have the same experience? Are they the same age? Do they have the same, are they putting in the same work hours? Are they, there's all these, and there's about 20 of them. And then you start to look at things through the lens of ocean, which you've probably done in psychology, right? That's for us. And I have a very cursory knowledge of psychology, to be clear. We used it in advertising because we had to understand behavioral science to sell people the 8th shirt. No one needs the 8th shirt, right? But you got to sell them an 8th shirt because that's your job. So who do you sell it to? You do ethnographic studies, demographic studies, psychographic studies, and then you look at all the personality traits. Say, oh, okay, so what works better in America specific to pay? Well, there's 2 huge pieces under the 5 personality traits. It's intelligence and conscientiousness. Yes. And we know from science that there's no such thing as a male brain being smarter than a female brain. So they're on par cognitively, right? We know that. So there's one piece. You're like, okay, that's where we started off. We're good. Then you look at agreeableness. That's a trait within personalities that it doesn't bode well for females, right? Because they don't ask for the same.
Joey, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Who is writing all of that? Is it men or women?
It's men. So, and thank you for pointing that out, because my brother, who's more liberal than I am, I think he's probably in your camp, he said the same thing. Yeah. He goes, you read all this white literature for men. Do you realize that? And I'm like, oh, that's a really good point.
Well, it's just not who's writing it. It's who's
purview.
Who's doing all this data analysis. How we're framing the issue. Because even it may actually be good. So when you said experience, well, if women can get pregnant, they can't work because our systems aren't created to enable women to work while they're pregnant or work while they have a child. And our society is fundamentally largely for women have to bear their. I mean, there's just a lot of things in which women have to do that men don't have to think about.
For sure, and that's also part of the analysis with pay, because the analysis numbers are based on hourly, and the hourly itself, if you pull a woman out of full-time employment to part-time, she's going to make less forever.
Yes.
And it's really hard for her to re-entry.
Experience.
Of course it is.
So it's
I'm just saying that it's a very complicated piece. And I can tell you, my wife is an executive in the ad business. And when I help her negotiate her salary every year, I tell her, no dude would ever say what you just said. And she's like, okay. And she didn't want the manager.
But that's a perfect example of a patriarchy, right? Because you have
it is, but I'm saying that also
from a male lens.
Yes, yeah, but all I'm saying is that it's there. That's one of the analyses, is that men don't put up with the same shit women do in the corporate landscape, because it's a patriarchy. I get it. I get that. I get that it's poisoned that way. But all I'm saying is that when you look at the same thing around patriarchy, is that it does exist. I don't have a problem with it.
Oh yeah,
with that. That's not an argument that I have. What I'm saying is that it's the same question I have with Defund the Police. What does it look like to deconstruct a patriarchy if females then are part of that patriarchy specific to social sciences, humanities, education? Because that's huge. I don't even know what the numbers are, but they're in the 80th, 90th percentile when it comes to social scientists, right? And you know this from your background. That's a staggering number. And by the way, that's hugely problematic, even at the feminist literature, because now peer reviews and citations are clouded by ideology of that group. And if you go against that group, the females in this case, you're going to be outed. You're not getting your PhD and you're not going to get hired. And so you start to then kind of fudge science or agree with an ideology. So that was my question, because one of the, I think, very cogent arguments on the right is that is it still a patriarchy if females are in charge? What does that mean?
I would push back against that, because I still think men are largely in charge.
They are. And the reason I'm pushing on it is because if you say smash the patriarchies, I've had this argument because my mom wonders why I don't attend Catholic Church anymore. The Catholic Church being an example that I talk about because they failed their number one duty, which is to protect children. And then they protected the men that hurt the children. And they continue to do so. So that to me is a failed patriarchy. Penn State was a failed patriarchy, right? They didn't protect fucking children. Same thing. Citadel, U.S. Gymnastics. There's tons of these patriarchies out there that are problematic and toxic. But you could also argue that the patriarchy is a structure much like capitalism. And if it becomes corrupted, it's corrupted. So that would be the question then, is if it's female dominated, is it a matriarchy? And if so, are they going to have the same problems that we have, that we can agree that we have with patriarchies, or what does that look like?
I think we can argue that, like for social work, that it's female dominated.
But that's good.
Well, yes, and well, no, I don't think it is. I think.
No, I'm asking. Is that good? Because like,
I think everyone agrees. There, like we all agree on the reason why most females are in that field, because of the patriarchy. But as a man in the field, and actually, I think it's good in the sense that I'm actually unlearning a lot of toxic masculinity. So I will say that, because I have to be sensitive to like not be so dominating and like and not be just sit back and actually listen. Like I've become much better at listening. I am still a big talker, so I'm trying to learn some of that. But yeah, so I think it's good and bad. I will say it defeats the whole purpose of feminism. Now, the point of feminism again is about equality. So, and I would never say there's a matriarchy, even if women dominate some sector of society, because when I say a patriarchy, I'm talking about the entire system.
It's the big system. Same thing you're talking about with the police. It's the
so even when it's one sector, it's like if I have a black dot on my entire white wall, I'm not going to say I'm not going to call it a black wall now. I'm going to say it's a white wall with one black dot. Same thing with the patriarchy. We have a patriarchy with one sector that is more dominated by females, which could be considered a matriarchy. That's kind of how I look at it. I think if you look at every single institution in a society, it's most likely going to be dominated by men.
Okay, so let me ask you this: if we had a more egalitarian approach, to everything, which historically I believed in, but as a corporate guy, and again, that's just my own selfish understanding, is that I have a lot of buddies at Google, and James Damore got a lot of flack for his article, and he got fired, and all of these pieces around that exact discussion, right? Yeah. Where he put out a memo that said, "Hey, men and women are different, and here's why they're different." And he was actually referencing evolutionary biology. It wasn't like he was being a dick. And I thought his memo on. But then when I, saw the hoopla and all that, I was like, wow. Okay, so statistically, there's 52% females in the workforce today. And if we have 1,000, let's just use 1,000 because I'm not good at math. If we have 1,000 developers at Google, we now have 520 of those need to be female for this to be on par with feminist literature. That's one aspect. The second one that I would ask is that if that's the case, we want to do that to be on balance, to be equal, to have equal outcomes, which I don't agree with. Do we do the same thing in social work? Do we fire 50% of these wonderful women that came into the field to help people because we need to replace them with men?
No. I think what you do is you make sure that, so when we talk about egalitarian, let's also talk about equity and about equality of opportunity. So I'm not an
outcome.
I'm not an equality of outcome guy. I'm an equality of opportunity guy.
Me too.
I'm a Rawlsian liberal. And so let's use that principle. Let's make sure that women are actually being given the same. And honestly, to balance the system, it's hard because you want to balance. There's two fronts. You want to balance the system in terms of making sure it's equal and making sure that. But at the same time, what you really want to do is you just want to make sure that opportunity is equally available to everyone. Again, not just the dichotomy of genders. So what you would do is you would make sure that you would do your best to make sure that equality was equitable and provided to every single person equally. So they can then choose to do
so they can self-select.
So they can do STEM, they can do social work, they can do whatever they want. Because at the end of the day, biology can explain that men have more muscle density than women do, or males have more muscle density than females do. But it doesn't. It barely, if at all, evolutionary biology explains behaviors at all. Because in society, we're all so different. And so there's so much diversity socially that we all have. And so I think the most important thing is just to make sure that we provide equal opportunity for every person.
Well, that I agree with. My question is because I think that's exactly, it's education, it's platforms, it's opportunity to learn. So if you want to be a social worker, let's just stick with there.
Yeah.
And you get there, and now you've gotten there, and now we have more of an egalitarian approach that is now being implemented for outcomes. That's my question. And that's the question on the right, by the way, is like, how do you regulate?
Yeah, that's problematic because I would assume that that would assume that that a field is based on it's hard because you want to, like, I would want to have a neutral approach to the sense that social work doesn't matter by gender. It just matters by the person. Yeah, it's just complicated.
I would take the same thing, but I have a bias for females that way. And because I grew up with a single mom and all my mom's friends were really wonderful and nurturing and maternal.
I grew up with a single mom too. And I'm a social worker now.
That's my bias. And so my bias on social work, the reason I asked the question, is it good? To me, it seems like it would be to have more women, but in the sense of the literature that we're talking about, critical race theory, feminist literature, all the stuff that I've done some homework on the last couple of years, the outcome is what they're asking for. And that's, again, where I think progressives are pushing it too far. Because if you then start to mandate numbers, and again, it gets much more complicated if you get Latinx and Asian and all of those pieces in there too, because then how do you balance that equation? But just for our purpose, let's just stick with men and women.
I think, if I can add, I think while you are right that they are saying equal outcome, I think really what they want is they want a fair fucking chance at it. And so they're not so stubborn and they're not like, it has to be 50-50. And if it's not 50-50, like, this is done. They're more so, I want the same fucking opportunity that this person gets. I think that's really the core of it.
But that, again, goes back to language. And that's kind of my beef in every aspect, because I have so much reverence for words, is that if you look at egalitarian studies, specifically longitudinal studies, like the ones they've had in Scandinavia, they've gotten to that point. And this is 30 years in the making now. When you look at, if self-selected, men are proving to select 20-1 in engineering and 20-1 in nursing. Those are numbers that are egalitarian as they could possibly be, based on a longitudinal study by liberals, by the way. Yeah. This isn't like a right wing. And there were women involved in this study, and they were not happy with the study. This was like, fuck. And this is what we were talking about with, hey, is there a case study around defund? Is there a case study around, CRT? Is there whatever the situation may be? You're like, okay, so that's my question. And that is a very poignant pushback from the right, because that's exactly, no one has an answer for this that I've talked to. You obviously are a very educated young man who cares about this stuff. And that's where it gets dangerous for me as an older man. Because if I was running an ad agency again, and someone came in and mandated that I had to fire, 20 people on my creative team who happened to be more male, and or I had to integrate gay and lesbian and blah blah blah, because if I didn't, then I wasn't mandated, or I wasn't in compliance, and I was going to get fined or shut down or whatever it may be. And as I said in my last call with my buddy around CRT, ad agencies don't hire diversity based on moral mandates. I wouldn't think that ad agencies none of my friends would claim that we're moral when it comes to a lot of the decisions we make. I think we're good human beings, but we also are aware that we're selling stuff. That's our job, right? We're hired by a brand to sell their shit. That's what we do. And it benefits our company if we have a gay, a lesbian, a black, an Asian, a white, and then viewpoint diversity as well. So you want people on the right. You want conservatives because, and again, not, crazy.
No, if we're going to look at it from a very the most diverse lens, we're going to include.
You want conservatives because historically they conserve institutions, and liberals historically like to blow stuff up and fix and rethink it. And so if you have that as a businessman, I like to look at those people and say, okay, I want these people on the strategy side to be liberal thinkers because they want to blow stuff up. Best practices by definition are things that people have done forever, and maybe they aren't the best. So you guys figure that out on the liberal side. And then on the right side, you have conservative thinkers, people that are really into sanctity and order and things like that in their personality traits. And because of that, they actually come up and they get shit done, right? So you're like, I want all these people. I want viewpoint diversity. I want ethnicity. I want even geography. Like all these things are really important. And for that purpose, it's in the self-interest of the ad agency to have viewpoint diversity, because when you're working with a client, you have a diverse group that you're selling to. And if you don't have representation, it doesn't work. And that I love is a microcosm for why I think equity and diversity and inclusion work is so necessary. It really should not be a huge debate because it actually benefits any company to have all these different pieces and parts. The question that has yet to be answered is what do we do with the example I gave you on the social work? What do we do with the nursing as an example? Because most, nurses are predominantly female.
I just think, given that we already know that women dominate social work, then we have an affirmative action approach for hiring more men.
And they're doing that, right? And I have friends that are working on those campaigns. And then they get hammered because they did the campaigns wrong. And so you're like, it's a good point. I think that we can agree that no one's looking at 50-50, that's not the argument. But I think that it is the difference between opportunity versus outcome. And then another conservative buddy of mine said to me, he was like, Joey, are you guys leaving your state to your kids? And I said, yeah. And he goes, okay, then you don't believe in opportunity and equal opportunity either. And I said, does it go back that far? And he goes, yes.
See, this is a hard thing, Joey, is when we get so philosophical with everything. And to be really honest, I'm an existentialist. So and I get so philosophical to a point where I'm just like, everything is meaningless and there's no right answer or anything. So that's why it's hard to have all these discussions because there's so many points of views and there's so many angles that we're all approaching this from. And we may all be right and we may all be wrong depending on how we contextualize it. But I think the bottom line for all of this is just to provide the same freaking opportunity for people who haven't had it historically.
I agree. And I just threw out the, inheriting thing as a joke because it does go back pretty far. And it is, I will admit my kids already have a head start. Like they went to private schools, they teach 2 languages, they have loving parents. It's a very.
And by the way, thank you for teaching them different languages because when we talk about diversity, when we talk about being inclusive, when we talk about embracing cultures and we talk about being of everyone else, that's one example of it. Like I am so mad that we don't teach multiple languages in this.
Oh, it's crazy. They do that in Europe. I mean, most of our friends in Europe speak at least 2, sometimes 3, 4 languages. And
really everywhere in the world, everyone has to learn, for the most part, everyone has to learn English and then they know their own language. So,
and we know through neuroplasticity studies that it actually benefits children to speak more than one language. Their brain fires differently. And we still don't get that joke, which is sad. All right. So
when you actually educate people and when you actually teach them that, teach them away from a myopic point of view, they're actually smarter and they're more empathetic. What?
Wow, crazy. Well, that is the running, like we said before, that's the fulcrum to every single problem.
Yeah.
If you look at, the inequality of our life, right? There's so many wonderful, I don't know if you've checked this out, but Intelligence Squared, it's a wonderful debate platform that I brag about on every show. And it's a British platform, but they have a moderator and then they have 4 whatever they're debating and against.
Yeah.
It's polite and they're subject matter experts. So it's not some dickbag, talking about how the virus is.
It's not Charlie Kirk debating about critical race theory.
It's not our friends from high school who flunked science talking about vaccines, right? Yeah. That's the kind of thing that drives me crazy. It's one of those things where I know I flunked out of chemistry, so I'm not going to really chime in on the efficacy.
I flunked out of chemistry too. Nice.
So I'm not involved in that debate. But when it comes to, education being the centerpiece, it's all of it. Because even climate change, they talk about if we could educate 50% more or 50% more of our population had a college degree.
Yep.
And this is only the United States, though. The climate change discussion wouldn't even be a discussion. It would be, what do we do with it?
Yep.
Right? What do we do with it?
Well, and I'll add experience too. If you're not experiencing climate change, why the fuck would you think about it? So education.
Well, I would also. He just froze on me. Okay, there you go. So, do you have stay at home and help my kids? And then I authored my book, and now I'm doing this podcast. So I have like all this free time, and that is a place of privilege, right? There's not a lot of people that just leave their career for a couple of years to do what I'm doing. So that is a place of privilege. And that's another piece when it comes to education. How much time do you have to think about these things? Like my mom, when I grew up,
you and I are so privileged in terms of having the opportunity to even learn about things.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean other people don't, the people who don't get to go to college and all these things and stay at home don't learn. It's just like, it's just, they don't have, when you're worrying about how to feed your child next, and when you're worrying about, are you going to be able to go to the doctors because you have health insurance? You don't have the opportunity to think about capitalism.
Well, that's my mom as an example, and it's a microcosm. I think what's wrong is that you don't blame someone for navigating the boat in the wrong direction when she's bailing it out, right? It's just like my mom was just emptying water from our little boat the whole time, and so people are like, well, "Why did you navigate towards a capitalist structure that made more sense?" And then you got educated, then you got a better job, and then you blah 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 blah. My mom, just didn't get that.
Yeah,
and I watched her work really hard in menial jobs. She cleaned houses for the last 10 years of her life, and it was just one of those things where I'm like, okay, they don't have time. This whole section of people doesn't have time. And maybe UBI is a great inroads to our capitalist structure discussion.
Oh, hell yeah.
Right? I know Andrew Yang kind of brought that to the fore, right, with his political campaign. And I just witnessed
he's trying to start a new political party.
I like him. The sad part about him is that he didn't have enough charisma to get anywhere. And I don't mean that as a pejorative. He's a nice guy. He just doesn't have, the political.
He's very
more introverted than he is, salesy. And I think sadly you kind of have to have that JFK, charisma in our culture to be looked at. But UBI,
or Obama,
Well, yeah, I mean Obama, just the charisma just poured out of him. Well, same with Bill Clinton. I was at a fundraising dinner for Bill Clinton in 99, I guess, and he walked into the ballroom and it was like boom. I mean, it was like it was out of hand, and he came up to our table just because we're there giving him money. But I'll never forget.
I'd be happy too if I was getting some money from you.
Well, yeah.
Hey.
It was, just to be clear, it was the company I was working for at the time. I didn't have enough money to
that's what I meant.
Yeah, so the UBI discussion, because to me, the UBI discussion talks to what we just mentioned, which is everyone says, oh, if we give people money, they're just going to sit on their ass and do nothing. And that goes against, for me, the fundamental belief that people work for money only. I mean, our structure right now, as far as the inequality, is stacked in that category where a lot of people like my mom, and it sounds like from where you grew up, they have to work to eat.
Yes.
And
Joey, that's most people.
I know. And that was the stats I think it was last year that came out, that's 40% of our population can't come up with $400 for an emergency, which means they are genuinely paycheck to paycheck. Yep. And if anything goes sideways, it's a problem. And so the UBI isn't about, which is funny too, by the way. So I was on the phone, my brother and I were talking to my mom about the child credits that went out.
Yeah.
And that her and her little friends, my mom's 81, and all her little octogenarian buddies in Rochester, Minnesota are sitting around talking. And they thought that the same thing. Well, I don't think those kids need that money. And I don't think every one of those parents needs that money. I said, Mom, me and my two brothers, time value of money, you would have had $750 extra every month.
Yep.
Would that have helped you? Well, yes, but we were poor. I said, yeah, I know, but that's the point. Yeah. This one initiative lifted 50% of our children out of poverty. And and my mom, because she lived with the right-wing lunatic husband for years, she just divorced him because she just had enough. But she's poisoned. Like this is you being benefited. Now you're pushing back because your friends. And my mom is financially comfortable because of this divorce. Yeah. But it blew me away that she wasn't even supporting UBI. She wasn't supporting child tax credits for this. And the culture, the narrative in our culture is that if you give people money, they will sit on their ass. And it's the welfare queen bullshit that Reagan started. And it's the stuff that
which was a dog whistle, by the way.
Well, it was a blowhorn.
Yes.
I don't think it was a dog whistle.
Thank you for that amendment.
and the same thing Derek Bell was talking about is that there's so much poverty, and that the fact that you can't live, if you got $500 a month, let's just say, that means you could ostensibly not freak out about feeding your kids. So just that level of stress reduction would help not only the individual, but it would help the culture. It would help your preemptive approach to your healthcare. It would help your stress levels. It would help your cortisol. It would help everything that's rushing through your body when you're constantly worried about everything going wrong, and that anything that goes wrong has a deleterious effect to your family's health and well-being.
You know, whether it's UBI, universal basic income, whether it's SSI, whatever it is, we need to figure out how to give income to the poorest Americans, because the poorest Americans, they take around like 20 something percent of all income. And then the top 1% takes like just way more than that. So like we have to figure out how to help most Americans. And we know that surviving, not even being able to afford $500 a month for emergency expenses, like they can't even do that. So there's obviously an income issue in this country. And so, we have to, I think it's incredibly important to support income-based programs that are actually don't have really any restrictions at all. You don't have to work. You don't have to prove these things. Maybe some basic things like, where do you live? And can you check in with me each year to let me know how you're doing? Like those are some basic requirements. But what we got to think about is when we give money to poor people or poorer people, they're going to spend it on local businesses. They're going to spend it in their communities. They're not going to outsource that money as billionaires are. So if we're really going to talk about welfare queens and kings, it's these fucking billionaires. It's these people. I
don't think there's any question there. But this is another differentiation. We agree 100% on this, because the numbers are pretty consistent. For every dollar you put in federal fund, you get $1.40 back. Yes. So historically,
it's Keynesian economics.
It is, and that's the cool thing about math is that it doesn't really matter what you think. It's just just math, and that is an agreed upon number for stimulus. We know that. Where I would actually make sure, and this is language too, the billionaire class is very small, right? And they're billionaires in part. There's the Koch brothers that inherited all their shit. That's possibly why they're such dickheads. But then there's guys like, Elon Musk as an example, who is a true, intrepid, genius entrepreneur, right? So for me, that's why I think with the frame.
And by the way, there's many other people that are way smarter than him that don't make that money.
Of course there are. But I'm saying that he's a businessman, right? He understands where to be, when to be, and how to do it. And
he got really lucky.
Well, on myriad fronts. I don't think anybody will admit without luck. Luck is involved. In fact, but what I'm saying is that it's the corporate laws. It's the laws in our body politic that allow money to be shoved out of the United States, not taxed, hidden within structures that don't allow you to know where the money is. So it's not. I don't think it's the billionaire's fault. And I've had this discussion with Brett McIntyre, because I love him, but he goes after the billionaires all the time, and he says that all billionaires are corrupt, all centimillionaires are corrupt, and it's like, no, and that's a narrative that gets really poisonous, specifically because I have some friends who made gobs and gobs and gobs of money to the point where they can't spend it, and they're wonderful people, and they get pushed back on this too. And so I think and this goes back to our capitalism destruct, because we agree on UBI, and I love that framing, by the way, because most people wouldn't even understand it. Yeah, just like, let's just chuck it into SSI or SSBI, like done, like perfect. I would love that
because it's already
there. Policy. Yes, and I love that. That's a great approach. Capitalism. How do you feel about what is? I know I don't think you, and I said this in my email to you. Yeah. A lot of your brethren, your iGen, people of your ilk at an educational level are very upset with capitalism. There's lots of talk around communism. And even in some of the intersectionality training methods, there's books with the sickle on it. It's like it's gotten to a point where you see this in the zeitgeist. What is your belief on capitalism? Can it be regulated? Because to me, that's the problem as a businessman. It needs to be regulated. It's a fucking Ferrari with no brakes. It's a problem. what is your thought on capitalism and or its replacement and or its remedy?
So I want to say it's immoral to be a billionaire unless you're giving all that money away. And same with multimillionaires. And the reason why is because most of us are dirt poor, relative. So, and we can explain that away with ignorance. You know, if you're super wealthy and you never see people dying and starving and being hungry, I get that. But I think it's immoral to be a billionaire given the context of most people. So that's first thing. Now,
well, most of those guys are giving away 90% of their wealth. Even Zuckerberg and Warren Buffett and all those cats, Bill Gates, they're giving away that money. So that's what I was addressing with Brett. I'm like, Come on, dude, don't use all and always and never, because those words are really powerful.
Well, it's that, but it's also just like, see, that's hard for me, because while they are giving away a lot of their wealth, they're still in yachts, they're still in these wealthy dinners, they're still, I mean, they're in a different class. And I think it's immoral to be in that different class when people are dying from food, malnutrition.
And I don't know where the excess is, but I would say that if you buy a $500 million yacht, and then there's something there that seems to be off for me. But again, I live in the biggest glass house in the world, and I wrote a book about being a douchebag. So I am a douchebag, and I own clothes that no one should own, and I've had cars that no one should own, because where is that equilibrium? I have no idea, because
it's hard. It's hard because we're with a capitalistic system, we have to work so hard for what we get. And so there's a sense of ownership of our private property and what we want to do with our funds. So we always have to be sensitive to that. But it's just to me, seeing what my clients go through every day, they're all formerly homeless. Yeah, it's just hard for me to accept the reality of being a billionaire. And who knows? I could be envious. There's a lot of things that we can consider, but to me, it's just there should be no excess when there's not enough for people.
I believe that in my heart, but I also I would push back on my kids. So here's an example. I think the world's going sideways, right? I think it's in trouble. So the more money I can put in my kids' coffers to say, you know what, guys, go out and do something good. You don't have to get a job that you don't like, right?
Yeah.
I've explained that to them already. Like, you go out and do what you love. If you want to, Kingston wants to be maybe make Legos. I mean, they're babies, right? These 8, 9 years old. They don't know what they want to do. But what I continue to drum into their brains, do what you love. And I said, it doesn't matter what you do, but help people.
Yeah.
You guys are both really lucky. Now, that's all they really understand at this point. You're really lucky. And I want you to take that luck and go help other people. And they're like, okay, Daddy, that's the idea behind it. So for me, as their dad, I want them to have enough money so they don't have to fucking freak out like I did my whole life about money. And so I don't know where that number is. Is it 20 million? I don't have $20 million, but I'm just saying, is it one of those things where I don't know? Because if I had 20 million, I don't think I'd give it away, to be truthful. I'd be like, guys, here's 10 million each. Figure it out. I put it in a trust fund, take care of your family, and then go help the world. But that's where that thing gets really weird for me, is like, where do morals play?
I think it's less about numbers. I think it's more about just making sure that people who are suffering and struggling have their needs met. So
I get that too, but I drive to school every day past hundreds, if not thousands, of really fucked up situations. Yeah. And I could possibly go out and help them right now.
Yeah. But and honestly, that's what we should really all be doing. But but I will say, the reason why I don't do that is because I'm fucking selfish. And I think the reason why we're selfish is because of our capitalistic system. It's embedded in us. It teaches us that we literally have to fucking scratch for what we have.
Everything.
And most of us are actually, most of the people who are successful. So when we talk about Bezos, when we talk about Musk, when we talk about Bill Gates, none of them started off in poverty. It's like it's like almost an anomaly to start off from poverty and become a billionaire or a millionaire. So generally, when you're impoverished, you're likely going to stay impoverished for the rest of from generation to generation to generation. I'm pretty sure there's statistics on it. I can't cite.
There is. Well, yeah. I can, because the out of the quintile, you have a 4% chance of jumping from abject poverty to poverty,
yes.
And from poverty to lower middle class is 8, and it continues to go up. So, like, if you start out where we did, like, I'm one of the anomalies that actually got out, and I got out based on luck.
Yes.
And the fact that I have unbelievable characteristics in our society that work well. I'm a salesman.
Well, and our mothers worked their fucking asses off.
Yeah, they did, and showed us what it takes to get through life. But But so on the capitalist piece, I agree with everything you just said. I think that, again, that it doesn't do progressives any good to use billionaires as a weapon or a wedge issue, because it throws everyone back on their feet. Because, again, whether these guys made it on their own or not, it's the laws of our body politic that allow these guys to hide their money, and that is immoral, right? And they don't pay taxes. The fact that Amazon doesn't pay taxes is insane. GE didn't pay taxes.
Or Donald Trump paid. I paid more taxes this month than Donald Trump paid.
Correct.
He paid like $794 that one.
Correct. Year. And that is the problem. That isn't capitalism. That's corruption.
Well, this is what I'll say. The reason why I think we focus on billionaires is because obviously we're all capitalists. If we're engaging in this, the only way to not be a capitalist is if we're not actually engaging in the economy, and like that's impossible because we can't survive if we don't. So that's how embedded capitalism is. You have to engage with it. But the reason why I think we all focus on billionaires and millionaires, it's because they're the peak capitalists. They're the ones that they want capitalism to run as effectively and as well as it can, because they make money. They make the most money off of that system. And so more of my criticism. So obviously they're not all of us have to change, because we're enabling these peak capitalists. So we all have to change. That's why. So that's one thing, and I can lead into socialism and communism from there. But I will say, in terms of capitalism is not a sustainable system. Where we have finite resources, and we need to. And capitalism is based on growth. And so if we're based on growth with finite resources, we're gonna run out of resources. And then, in California, we may we have a huge water issue, and in the future we'll probably have water wars if we continue to have this system, because the lead capitalists will own all the fucking water, and then that's more of a hypothetical. But what I'm saying is that the system of capitalism is unsustainable. So that is my biggest critique of it. And it's literally destroying our climate, because it's trying to extract as many resources. And not only that, it's about growth. So if you and I keep buying more and more and more and more, and then the garbage in our oceans continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it continues to pollute all of our ocean water, that's going to completely destroy our entire ecosystem, and we're all going to die. The more our atmosphere and our climate is being destroyed through pollution, we're not going to have the means to survive, because our entire ecosystem is going to be destroyed. So,
have you heard of Eric Weinstein?
I have not. Is he a deep ecologist?
No, he's actually a mathematician. And so the reason I brought that up is that he's someone that I've been following lately. He's Brett Weinstein's brother. Brett Weinstein was the professor that was outed at Evergreen. And they're both academics, and they're both really, really smart, and they're both liberal. So I bring that up for a reason. He says the same thing. In a microcosm, he thinks that capitalism, socialism have to kind of get married.
Mixed economy.
Yeah. And this is a mathematician, right? So undergrad at UPenn, MIT, mathematician, just off the chart smart. He's the managing director for Peter Thiel Capital. And he talked about this, and he said the same thing you did. Capitalism itself is in a problematic state because it can't continue to grow, because that's what capitalism is. Everything's measured at GDP. And the problem there is that we can't continue to grow. And he uses education as an example. And he says education 40 years ago was where professors printed PhDs. And the system itself is based on that, because it's free labor.
Yeah.
Right? So if you were a professor, which let's say you get your PhD, and I'm sure you will, you would say, I want to have TAs, postdocs, helping me with my stuff, my class, all of that. If you print 20 PhDs from your whatever you major in, 18 of those are not getting jobs.
Yeah.
So what he's saying is that the educational system, as an example, as a microcosm, is broken because it can't continue to grow. He also uses law firms as an example of that. Because law firms, as you probably are aware, when I was coming up in the business world, law firms were the shit. Like in the 80s, Skadden Arps, Meagher and Flom, big firm in New York City. I sold software to these companies. These guys were making $2 million a year as partners. And this was in the 80s. That's like real money, right? Yeah. And if you've witnessed the decimation of the industry of law, that's because that has happened. And it's happening now.
There's too many fucking lawyers.
Well, not only, but you can't make them, there's not enough work for them. So if you have a partner and you bring in all these associates that aspire to be a partner, they can't all make partner. And because they can't all make partner, it's a pyramid scheme now. And he's saying the same thing about the education. PhDs are a pyramid scheme. So I agree with you on that front.
So so it's just people get scared of the word socialism and communism and all these things.
You understand why, right? I mean, because
I know, I understand why, but in my mind, there's never been a communist nation in the world, and the reason why I say that is theoretically, in order for communism to exist, it has to be a collective action of everyone agreeing to that system. That is what a truly communistic system is. The purest form of democracy in which everyone agrees, basically, but economically.
Right. So let me ask you this. When you talk about social democracy, is AOC on that camp, or is she still a capitalist in the sense that you talked about? Because she seems to me the most progressive. She seems to be one of the most progressive candidates we have out there, right?
Yeah.
And when she's fighting that battle, she's doing so within the confines of a capitalistic structure, correct?
Well, yeah, because it's the dominant structure.
Right.
And so I don't think she's ever identified as a social democrat, though.
No, she's a democratic socialist, much like Bernie. So that's again why it's cool. Thank you for differentiating those two, because that's important. And then specific to your experience and what you're doing in Sacramento, do you see, is your generation and people that you are working with, is this a consensus that people think this is where we need to go, or
No. I mean, I can't speak for everyone because that's just impossible to do. But I will say that, like, I think I'm just as unique as everyone. But I don't think people. I haven't found my niche yet in terms of people who think like I do, specifically because we're all liberals, and well, at least my political group is. Yeah. And so we're so diverse in our thinking, but I do think there's a consensus in that capitalism is not sustainable.
I will agree with that, and I think that part of what you're getting into, and the reason I brought the communism piece up, is that I had this discussion with Brett as well, and I know if he watches this, he'll be like, "Dude, you can't talk about me." But I love him, and we just disagree.
Hey, Brett.
Hi, Brett. Is that when I bring up communism to him, you said the same thing, is that we've yet to ever have a true theoretically driven communist experience.
Yeah. Because as Marx explains it, communism is when socialism is fulfilled.
Correct. And that's what Richard Wolff talks about too, right? So I get that because I've done some homework on it, but the one that is an argument, which I get, but where it comes from is that you look at, Mao, you look at Pol Pot, you look at Stalin.
Dictators.
They're all dictators, and that's what happens in this communist structure historically. It doesn't mean that it could be, but that's the utopian argument on the right, is that you can't replace anything with the utopian vision because it just doesn't fucking work, right? And communism has never worked. And if anybody like Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about that in his book, right, the Gulag Archipelago, which to me was the most riveting and gross example of communism ever. And they're all bad. There's not one example of communism that works. And so to me, this kind of goes to the baby steps of trying to get change, is that we can't in good faith use communism as an example and then use arguments that it has never been done right, because that's another one from the right. If I did it, I'm a benevolent leader, I would make sure it worked. And or if I did it with a group of people that I trusted, then we would be able to make it work, because it just hasn't. And that's the human condition. I don't trust human beings with that much power.
Joey, I think it goes back to, how we created how I offer 3 definitions for CRT. Yeah. I think it's the same thing with communism. There's an academic Marxist or Karl Marx point of view of what communism actually is. And conservatives aren't having that conversation. They're having the conversation of the cultural narrative of what it is.
I agree. But that's also why I think the word is poison. And it's poisonous because historically it's fucking poisonous.
But hey, when conservatives know how to poison words, like racism.
True. Yeah, exactly.
So it's like knowing how to buy that and like say, okay, yes, like we need to figure out a way to communicate with you because we're community at the end of the day.
But so it's been fantastic, dude. We've been on the 2 hours and 24 minutes. So let me just say this. I look forward to watching you get your PhD, which I'm sure you'll probably do. I look forward to watching what you do with the Young Democrats of America and the Social Democrats and the Progressive Democrats and the Hispanic Latinx caucus and your Young Democrats of America. Kudos to you for all that you're doing. You're doing great work. I think you're a fine young man with a big brain, and we need people like you out there. And thank you again for your time and energy today, because we didn't know each other from Adam, and you left your job today with your boss's permission to come and talk to some dude on a podcast about solving all the world's problems in 2 hours and 26 minutes. So I really appreciate your time today, dude.
And we didn't get to talk about Texas abortion law. So next time.
There was not a lot of controversy on that. It's fucking draconian and awful. And yes.
Okay, I'm happy we can agree on that, which I obviously knew we did.
Yeah, no. Yes. So thanks again, dude.